This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a programme brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust and sponsored by Heritage New Zealand. I'm Dougal Stevenson. In this programme, Gregor Campbell covers the mystery surrounding a corpse found at Waikouaiti. Bill Southworth discovers how the Port Chalmers community regarded a long-running watersiders dispute, and Alison Breese looks at the history of the Otago School of Mines. The discovery of a corpse in a railway ditch in Waikouaiti caused a sensation in the 19th century. Who it was and what it was stirred up much controversy. This report from Gregor Campbell.
In 1890, a sensation burst over the gentle residents of Dunedin and towns to the north. Human remains were found one high summer by boys, as boys will, exploring under a railway culvert. This story comes with the casual racism of its times, with which this writer does in no way agree. A Waikouaiti mystery, human remains found in a railway drain. A human skeleton in an advanced stage of decomposition was, writes our Waikouaiti correspondent, found on Saturday morning by some boys in a channel cut in the formation of the railway line quite close to the railway station. How the remains came to be where they are is a mystery, and as no one has been missed from the district, their identification is not likely to be easily accomplished. The channel or drain was cut some 12 years ago when the railway was formed. Since then, there has always been about 3 feet of water in it, but the recent drought has had the effect of drying up the water and thus led to the recovery of the remains. From the surrounding circumstances, the case appears to be one of determined suicide or a brutal murder, the facts pointing more strongly to murder than suicide. And with the remains were found 2 pieces of iron rail, each weighing from 5 to 6 pounds, which were apparently round the neck of the body, and thus kept it from coming to the surface. As already stated, there is no one missing from the district, and no clue to identification. The Star was able to provide further details in anticipation of a post-mortem a few days later. The supposition is that the man was either a stranger who was waylaid and killed near the place where the remains had been found, or that he had been done to death in another locality, carried in a vehicle to Waikouaiti, and there hidden in the ditch. The latter seems more than likely to be the correct solution of the mystery. In this connection, a somewhat curious circumstance is recollected. Writing under the date of August 23, 1889, our London correspondent told how a man named Robert Perris Stewart, a private in the 1st Battalion of Scots Guards, where he appeared to have borne an excellent character, walked into the Caledonian Road police station on Saturday, August 24, and gave himself up for murdering a man named Muir in New Zealand 12 years ago. He then said that the deed had been committed in Otepopo bush, where he and his victim had evidently been working. He struck Muir over the head with a large lump of wood and killed him. At first the authorities were unwilling to believe Stewart's statement, but he persisted in alleging that what he said was true. He was ultimately locked up when the police authorities at home decided to make inquiries as to the likelihood of his statement being true. The man was said to be in a very excited state and appeared to be suffering from remorse, and after confessing, gave it out that his conscience was much relieved and that he was much easier in his mind. When the story was published by us, the police here regarded the confession as the act of a man whose mind had been unhinged. But now his story is remembered, and some people are apparently inclined to believe that there was something in it. We have made inquiries, and, so far as data in the local police department is concerned, there seems to be foundation for the opinion that the body of the supposed murdered man has never been found. And when it is considered that for some time there was considerable passenger traffic through and in the vicinity of the Otepopo bush, the facts seem to point to the belief that the body was not left there by Stewart, but, if a murder did take place, was secreted somewhere. The following month, in early April, the Timaru Herald had further developments. Our readers will remember that some days ago 2 boys at Waikouaiti found in a ditch not far from the railway station what appeared to be the remains of a full-grown human being. The police were at once communicated with, and their investigations led them to suspect strongly that a murder had been committed, and that for the purpose of concealment the body had been placed in the ditch at a time when it was full of water. The sergeant who examined the spot found, embedded in the mud and underneath where the skull had lain, 2 pieces of iron rail. On removing them, he found portions of a coarse canvas bag. The only report to which we have access is closely condensed, and no doubt the sergeant gave very much fuller particulars than those which appeared in print. However, the theory adopted by the police was that the body had been placed in the ditch and weighted down in the water by the 2 pieces of iron rail tied into the bag, and that in process of time the bag had, to a considerable extent, rotted away. It was proved that the ditch had only recently become dry. Dr. Hislop, the medical man who examined the remains, gave the following evidence before the coroner. He believed the remains to be those of a Chinaman because of the shape of the skull, which appeared to belong to the Mongolian type. The eye cavities and the upper jaw pointed to that conclusion, and the lower jaw was massive and very wide at the back part. He also judged of this from the fact that the head appeared to be a large one on a small body. The teeth were stained yellow as if with opium smoking. The height of the man would be about 5 feet, and as the teeth were worn down, he judged him to have been a middle-aged man. He thought also that he could not have been an old man from the shape of certain bones which alter at old age, but in this case had not. With some diffidence he expressed the opinion from the condition of the bones that the man had not been dead more than 3 years, and it was with the knowledge that the bones had been underwater all the time that he offered the opinion. The jury found that there was, from the surrounding circumstances, very grave suspicion that the said unknown man came to his death by foul play. Now, for the second chapter of this strange affair. A few days after the inquest, the Otago Daily Times published the following paragraph. A Waikouaiti correspondent writes in all seriousness that the skeleton found in a ditch near the railway station there was that of a gorilla. He states, shortly after the railway was opened here in 1878, a circus passed through. A gorilla died, and the proprietors, not wishing to waste time, put the remains in a bag and threw the bag and the contents into the ditch or channel near the railway station. On the whole of these facts and statements, it is evident that further very serious inquiry is absolutely necessary. We entertain a strong suspicion that the letter which we have just quoted is not to be depended upon. We do not remember that any circuses in New Zealand in 1878 or in any other year had with it a gorilla or other very large ape, but on that point we may possibly be mistaken. If the letter is an invention, the writer of it should be thoroughly ashamed of himself, for his statement is calculated to throw dust in the eyes of the police in their efforts to reach the perpetrator of a dreadful crime. On the other hand, if the latter be true, and the remains found were those of a gorilla or orangutan, how can Dr. Hislop account for his having been betrayed into so grave a mistake as to pronounce the Waikouaiti remains to be those of a human being and probably of a Chinaman who had been addicted to the use of opium? How indeed could Dr. Hislop account for his mistake? I suppose, although he had met a number of Chinese people by 1890, he had never seen a gorilla. And I am the decidedly human Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
In 1951, a wage dispute on the country's wharves became the longest and most disruptive and costly industrial stoppage in our history. Many thousands of workers were involved, including 200 wharfies at Port Chalmers. How this affected them and their tight-knit port community has been the subject of a fascinating honours thesis by Andrea Hoteri. This report from Bill Southworth.
When Port Chalmers wharfies and their families opened their Otago Daily Times in March 1951, they may have been somewhat bemused by the way the newspaper portrayed them. The daily cartoon showed the Russian Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin as a puppet master pulling the strings of a wharfie puppet. This made the wharfie puppet bash a big club over the head of a tam o' shanter-wearing Otago citizen. An accompanying editorial said,
"The present strike on the New Zealand waterfront is part of a worldwide war conspiracy which in this country, as in Australia, is manifested in outrageous attempts to destroy the national economy, to paralyse industry and communications, and to reduce the standards of living to the level at which communist propaganda becomes effective."
The Cold War and the Hot War against communist North Korea, where Kiwi soldiers were involved, were raging at the time, so the wharfies basically were being portrayed as gullible traitors. There was nothing the port wharfies could do to counter the accusation, because the government had made it a criminal offence to publish their side of the dispute, and the media had bowed down to this censorship. The actual wage dispute was straightforward. Port employers had failed to pass on a 15% general wage order, saying the wharfies had a partial pay increase earlier in the year. The National Union imposed an overtime ban in protest, because overtime was not compulsory under their award agreements. The employers then locked out every watersider in the country, and the government dramatically used soldiers and sailors to load the ships. It made it a criminal offence to give food to the wharfies' families, in an apparent attempt to starve them back to work. The government had also seized the bank accounts of the union and made it an illegal organisation. They then launched unopposed media attacks on the watersiders, accusing them of being led by the nose by communists, although, apart from the odd exception at a lower level, none of their leaders were in fact communists. Despite all this, the 200 wharfies at Port Chalmers stayed solid for months and were joined in sympathy by striking miners, freezing workers, drivers, railway workers, and many others. But what effect did all this have on the close-knit community of Port Chalmers? Andrea Hotary set out to find out when she did her thesis for a BA Honours degree. She said that although she now lives in Auckland, she was still very fond of Port Chalmers, where she grew up, with her artist father, Ralph Hotary, and a poet mother, Cilla McQueen. Andrea largely based her thesis around interviews with elderly watersiders and their now adult children. She found the port acted a little bit like a Welsh mining village when the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher took on the miners' union. The port people stuck together and largely backed the watersiders. Traditionally, there had been regular dances and local sporting teams, and this had helped to solidify the sense of community. There was a further expression of this when the locked-out workers got together and built club rooms for the local rugby club. Those who opposed them usually had the wisdom to keep a diplomatic silence. Some local businessmen did criticise them and found that their businesses suffered as a consequence. One local publican was amongst them, and the wharfies stopped using his pub. He sold up and moved away. The food shops in port usually gave locked-out families an unlimited line of credit, which they slowly paid back after the dispute ended. This made a great deal of sense because out of gratitude the wharfies stayed loyal to those shops forever after. Relief committees were set up, and the union was able to pay men with families a small amount of subsistence money. Despite the fact it became a criminal offence to give locked-out families food, their neighbours largely ignored this prohibition and were willing to take risks. Jack Stanley, who has just celebrated his 87th birthday, was the son of a watersider and remembers the family getting food from a surprising source.
In those days, we lived directly behind the police station. We lived on a level with the top floor of the police station, so that when the sergeant's wife, Mrs. O'Shea, came out, her back door was level with the front of our house. She would sing out, say, Jack, come over. And I'd go over and go up and say, well, the first time I thought, oh, goodness me, what have I done wrong now, So anyway, I'd go up. And I knew them because we were Catholics, they were Catholics. And often I used to sneak down on a Sunday morning to get a ride to church with him because he had the flashiest car in Port Chalmers. The sergeant had the the big car, and I used to deliberately time it so that I'd go down and he'd say, "Oh boy, come on, I'll give you a..." And that was a novelty in those days because we didn't have cars. So, yeah, I went up the first time and she said, "Oh, Jack," she says, "I'm embarrassed." She says, "I've made this big pot of stew and it's just too much for us, and we don't want to eat it again. So, and I don't want to waste it. Can't waste food, you know. Would you like to take it home for your mother?" So I took it home, and of course the pot was full. So, you know, obviously it was not made for her family at all. So this happened the first time, and then happened quite a few times after that. It was quite a regular occurrence that we would get supplied with food by the sergeant's wife, who, you know, was governed by the laws of the land that says no way was he allowed to do that. But she allowed to do that.
The close-knit community of Port Chalmers and the surrounding district also didn't seem too impressed with the new laws and came up with a whole raft of ways to defy them. Jack Stanley again.
Then, of course, there was food gathered in from the countryside. The farmers used to actually send produce in, and there was quite an organisation, I believe, that went on, and there was money donated from people that didn't want to see the families suffer.
It was unusual for married women to work in 1951, but many port women went looking for work, and some found it in Dunedin and elsewhere. It had a profound effect on the customary sexual division of labour, and some women believed the dispute resulted in them having a more independent outlook on life. One local factory helped a great deal.
The local shirt factory employed some of the women during the strike period, and I don't know how they worked it or how they did it at all, but everybody in Port Chalmers knew what was going on, and probably the police, but nobody said anything.
After they'd been locked out for 4 months, the local union could see the battle was lost. On the advice of their president, Neil Crichton, they voted to go back to work. 12 refused to do so and held out for another month until their national federation recommended that everyone who could should return to work. These 12 were the only ones to get coveted loyalty cards from the Watersiders Federation. Because the local union had decided to go back as a body, it ensured that more union men returned to the wharves than was the case of the rest of the country. For example, those who'd been working as a separate group on the Dunedin city wharves didn't fare as well. But in Port Chalmers, by October that year, 94% of the men who'd been locked out were back on the wharf and in the new union. Tired of what seemed to be endless union militancy on the docks, the government had set out to teach the wharfies a lesson. It wanted to destroy the National Union, and it succeeded. But in doing so, it seemed to go over the top. Its suppression of the media being allowed to give the wharfies' side makes sure that the public supported it. But its methods seemed excessive. The leaders of the Unionists, Jock Barn and Toby Hill, squandered the loyalty of their members by not realising it was stupid to take on the government. Nevertheless, its union members, and probably most of their families, stuck by it for 151 days. But the last word is best left for Andrea.
To some extent, class politics provided a basis from which to create a new sense of community. Some young men absorbed their father's strong union sentiments and subsequently worked on the wharves themselves. The experience of the 1951 lockout also meant, however, that several families discouraged their offspring from joining the wharf. The lockout has faded in the minds of many people, but the repercussions continue to influence the lives of those who experienced it directly, long after the rest of the country felt it best forgotten. 1951 left heroes and a distinct mythology in the hearts of many people.
I am grateful to Andrea Hotary for much of this material. The opinions are my own. This is Bill Southworth reporting.
The School of Mines at the University of Otago was established in 1878 and was the only university degree in mining and metallurgy that ran in New Zealand. From dealing with flickering gas lamps and being housed in an old tin shed on campus in the 1800s, the school rose to international prominence in the early 20th century. This report from Alison, Breese.
Recently, I have been upgrading and adding more information to our University of Otago buildings that we have on the Rarangi Kōrero Heritage New Zealand list. These important buildings were some of the early buildings listed, but the information required at the time was not as rigorous as it is now. As part of our listing work, we like to upgrade reports with more information and update the last few decades with what has been happening with these buildings or places. The School of Mines building is one of the buildings of the important University of Otago complex and was built in 1909. But what was the School of Mines? The internationally renowned School of Mines at the University of Otago was established in 1878 and was the only university degree in mining and metallurgy that ran in New Zealand. The Otago Provincial Council established New Zealand's first university in 1869. The complex of university buildings were built between 1878 and the 1920s, and they constitute a major example of 19th and early 20th century Gothic in New Zealand. In 1876, architect Maxwell Berry won the competition for the design of the clock tower, geology, professorial houses for the Otago University in 1877. Architect Edmund Anscombe faithfully followed the design set by Berry as the campus continued to grow over the decades. A School of Mines was envisaged early in the establishment of the university. At the inaugural meeting of the University Council in 1869, James McAndrew urged that consideration be given to establish a School of Mines. One of the first professors, Professor J.G. Black, taught metallurgy as part of his natural sciences courses and had been a prospector on the West Coast, as well as his colleague Professor Sale, who had been a miner and a commissioner on the West Coast goldfields. In 1878, the school was established by Professor G.H.F. Ulrich as its first director. Ulrich was born in Zellerfeld, Germany, and graduated with a distinction from the Royal Academy of Mines in 1851. He emigrated to Australia, arriving in Melbourne in August 1853, where he worked many positions in mining, including lecturing at universities there. In 1875, Ulrich was asked by the Otago Provincial Council to examine the goldfields of the province. He visited New Zealand that year, and his report was published together with that of F.W. Hutton on the geology of Otago. He and his family arrived in Dunedin early in 1878 after being offered the position of director of the University of Otago School of Mines. Besides being director of the school, Ulrich became professor of mineralogy and metallurgy. Until 1880, he was also temporary director of the Otago Museum, following F.W. Hutton, and did much to improve the museum's exhibits. The School of Mines was the only institution in New Zealand which ran a university degree. However, Richard Seddon, Minister of Mines, was opposed to the school as he saw it as an elitist institution that was undemocratic and stated there would be no more government funds unless evening classes were conducted and fees reduced to appeal to a wider range of students. The School of Mines moved into a new building in 1890, known as the Old Tin Shed, as it was built from scraps left from the 1890 exhibition. By 1892, the combination of the evening classes, which proved very unpopular, and the combination of trying to see specimens through a microscope with the flickering gas lamps proved very unpopular. However, a gold dredging boom occurred in Otago in the 1890s, which increased the interest in mining courses and the school's role. By 1899, there were 50 students, and the school now had the problem of becoming overcrowded and short of equipment. Another issue was the graduates also left for overseas positions rather than staying in New Zealand. Many students would have liked to have had positions locally, but to become a mine manager in the metal field, a certificate was needed, with the examination held in Wellington, and then 3 years practical experience was required. A coal mine manager required 5 years. Professor Ulrich widened the school's scope by becoming the first serious mineralogist in Australasia, and under Ulrich, the school was compared to the famous Royal School of Mines for 1909. Ulrich died in 1900, and Professor James Park took over the school. Professor Park, the director until the 1930s, was described as a man of great personality and confidence. He had studied geology and mining at the Royal School of Mines before he arrived in New Zealand. Despite Seddon's continual efforts to move the school out of Otago, a rowdy protest saw the school retained in Dunedin. Seddon continued to argue that there was too much unnecessary duplication of courses across New Zealand. He believed Otago should concentrate on the medical school and the School of Mines could move to Auckland. In 1907, Parliament voted for a new building. It was completed in 1909, designed by Edmund Anscombe, and finally meant the students and staff no longer had to contend with a leaky old tin shed. The new school was constructed of Leith Valley andesite and Oamaru stone facings with a slate roof. It had 3 lecture rooms, 8 laboratories, a museum, a small library, photographic rooms, storerooms and cellars. It had electricity installed to enable better lighting, so no more flickering gas lamps. When Allen Hall was built in 1912-1914, the 2 buildings were then connected by the entrance archway that we know today. The outbreak of the First World War had a huge impact on the school, and with students enlisting into the war. Out of 27 students, 19 went on overseas service. By 1918, the school was just down to 12 students who were all too young to join the forces. One of the staff, Professor Waters, never gained his health after returning home invalided in 1917. The role did slowly recover, with 66 students in 1926. After World War II, New Zealand's interest in industrialisation increased, and the new professor, G.J. Williams, planned to implement a diploma in coal mining as well as expanding into surveying. However, the emphasis on the coal industry was short-lived as the country's focus turned to oil and electricity. The School of Mines was transferred to Auckland in 1962, leaving the smaller Department of Mineral Technology in the building. Surveying was moved into the Department of Science. The Mineral Technology Department was finally transferred north in 1986, and the building now houses the Department of Marketing. There is one remaining remnant from the School of Mines, a rock crushing machine which remains immovable, still in the basement. The University of Otago School of Mines is a registered Category 1 historic place. You can find the story on our heritage list online shortly at heritage.org.nz. And this is Alison Breese for Heritage New Zealand, Poheri Tonga, reporting for Heritage Matters.
The award-winning Heritage Matters is broadcast on the first Monday of each month at 9:30am and replayed on the following Sunday at 7pm. There are further replays on the third week of the month, Thursday at 1pm and Sunday at 7pm. Or you can listen as a podcast from the Otago Access Radio website at oar.org.nz.
As Aotearoa New Zealand's national heritage agency, Heritage New Zealand Poheri Taonga is proud to sponsor Heritage Matters. Celebrate our heritage by becoming a member to visit more than 20 heritage places we care for across the motu for free. You'll receive a subscription to our award-winning magazine, exclusive member events, and free or discounted admission to over 1,000 international heritage places. Support the heritage of Aotearoa New Zealand. Check out visitheritage.co.nz.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.